there's things we're all trying to do to make the world more inclusive and barrier free, and we'll keep chipping away on that. But it's sort of in the interim, we all have to respond and deal with those situations, and we can choose whether it beats us or we give up or we give in, or we put the flag in the sand and said, no, I'm not taking no for an answer.
Martyn, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm really excited for this conversation because I think it's going to be super interesting considering what you do and your job role. So I'm really looking forward to diving in and exploring that topic.
Yeah, me too. I've loved your other episodes, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun and a lot of varied conversation.
Fingers crossed. That's what we always aim for. So let's hope it carries on today. So, my first question that I ask absolutely every single person is, how do you refer to your disability?
So in terms of disabled people, disabled person, rather than person with a disability, and we can go down some of that language because I found that whole topic fascinating through particularly the career side of life. But my condition is spinal muscular atrophy, which is under the umbrella of muscular dystrophy. And I'm in a power chair all day and have care support. So it's a neuromuscular disability.
Yeah. Who was I talking to? Someone trying to explain what the muscle looks like with muscular atrophy. And it was something like it looks super, when we're looking at it under a microscope, it can look super stretched out rather than like your muscle compared to my muscle, they would look completely different. Yours would look like it's almost like blue tack and that type of stretch, whereas mine would look, well, depending on how old you are, but generally if you don't have any muscular issues, your muscles are a bit shorter. And I found that fascinating.
That is, I've not heard that one either. So
I know. We love, like, every day is a school day.
I love that expression. That's so true. Yeah.
Every day is a school day. But also what I love about that is that this is your disability we're talking about, and I've said something that you didn't know. Whereas I know that in like 10 minutes time, you'll tell me something about my own disability that I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. But it's how it works in disability, because not everybody knows everything about their own disability. Absolutely. Which people seem to really struggle with.
Yeah, it's so true.
So, with muscular spinal atrophy, is that something that's diagnosed early on in life, or is it something that kind of is progressive and is more apparent the older you get?
Yeah, so it's genetic. So anyone with SMA is born with SMA. And personally, and I think quite a lot of my peers, certainly of my age as well, there was about 18 months old when I was diagnosed. So it essentially, as babies are developing, someone with SMA is not developing in the same way with the muscle and the movement side.
Yeah.
And interestingly, on my mum's side, I've got two cousins who have a disability, a similar age, both males as well. One has Down syndrome and one's profoundly deaf. And David, who's deaf, we're like 3 months apart. We're really close in age. And so as we were, growing up, there was like, well, Martyn's not moving that much here compared to David, but David doesn't respond to noises like Martyn does. So that was quite interesting, the sort of two similar age boys that we were and are having that kind of comparative as well. But fundamentally after, and this is obviously what mum and dad told me, I don't remember 18 months old too well, but it was like, went to the doctor, went to a consultant, and they did a muscle biopsy. So I've got a tiny little scar on my thigh where they took that muscle biopsy and then they said, it's spinal muscular atrophy.
That must have been fascinating for you growing up, to have a cousin around about a similar age who's like cousins who are also similar ages, who are also disabled, because that very rarely happens, that there's that much disability all in one space, and particularly when it's like familial. Because when I
Yeah,
think about, I grew up with my cousins, and don't get me wrong, they are a bit older than me, and they will kill me for saying that. But like, none of them are disabled. It's just me. So to be able to have that, not, and I don't mean comparison, but I kind of do mean comparison, because disability
yeah,
is very much an umbrella term, and we're comparing and contrasting here. Must have been quite comforting in a different sense, because you weren't the only one who was like this quote unquote different kid.
yeah, yeah. That's true. There was definitely, because I went to the local primary school,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a small village, and there was only a couple of hundred students in the whole school. But I always say, like, I was the only disabled in the village, so it was that. To your point, there was like
Yeah.
that experience. But then,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you're right. Within the family setting, I wasn't the only disabled
Yeah.
person. There were, but then also different disabilities that affected
Yeah.
us in different ways.
Yeah. God, that must have been wild. I would have loved to have had someone who was similar ages to me with different disabilities, because I feel like I would have got them to come along and play a lot of pranks with me.
Yeah, we did have a lot of fun. Like the story I often tell is like, so then and still now, I have to have help at night to turn over just to get comfortable. If I'm in the same position as anyone, it gets a bit uncomfortable, but I can't roll myself, so someone else,
Yeah.
yeah, has to do that. So when I used to stay over at David's, he could help me, but in the middle of the night couldn't hear me saying, "Can you help me?" So I'd have like a couple of teddies on the bed next to me to launch them at his head to wake him up so that he could then turn me over. So there's all these like random little sort of
Yeah.
funny, not funny, but funny moments, you know.
It's like disability humor, which is like different
Exactly.
to like normal humor, because there's like a
Yes.
level
Yeah.
of understanding that there's some kind of like, there's something kind of dark in it, but actually
Yes.
like it's actually from a very loving place, but you don't really understand why it's so funny unless you're part of the disabled crew.
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah.
So interestingly, with that experience, you said obviously there was childhood, and you were very much like the only disabled person in the village. What was that whole scholastic experience like for you, and growing up as a disabled child? And I'm particularly interested in, when we talk about schools, like access needs, were they met? Did your school know how to handle your access needs? And was it a, not like a good or bad experience, but like on reflection, do you think things could have been done better?
Yeah, I mean, I think now, having met so many different disabled people, different conditions, different experiences, different upbringing, I feel lucky really that
Mm-hmm.
the school and everything around that was very positive, because it's such an important part of anyone's life, disabled or
Yeah.
not, those formative years. And so they built ramps to make sure I could get in all the doors where there were steps. I was statemented, so I had what were called learning support assistants back when I
Mm-hmm.
was at school, at TAs now. Um, and I'm sure, like, I know one story actually quite early on, more at nursery when I was about 3 or 4, they were going to refuse me because not because of the wheelchair, but because of the extra support I would need.
Mm-hmm.
My and this probably speaks a lot to complementary to the primary school being very good. My mum and dad have always fought where there needed to be a
Mm-hmm.
fight. So I,
Yeah.
I, I think even with the school, there were probably things that mum and dad had to fight or at least lead on. But I don't remember there being a point that I couldn't get in a room, or I didn't have an
Mm-hmm.
LSA, or I couldn't access the curriculum and all that. So my memory is all very positive. There may have
Yeah.
been conversations going on that enabled that to happen, of course. But yeah, with the nursery example, my mum was like, but Martyn's the only one who's actually toilet trained. So it was like she made the
Yeah.
point that whilst I've got SMA, I'm in the wheelchair, I will need physical help. It wasn't even that different to the help that a lot of the other children needed that didn't
Mm-hmm.
have an inverted commas disability. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that mum and dad's part was vital, but overall the primary school experience was pretty positive. And I like played football with my mates on the school field, just using my wheelchair to knock the ball around. And I don't ever remember feeling like bullied or othered. And so, yeah, it was a very positive experience.
I love that so much. And I think what you said is so important about your parents, because I think there's nothing more feisty than disabled parents, particularly
So
when they
true.
have to fight for so much. And what was
Yeah.
really interesting, as you said, like there were probably conversations behind closed doors that you weren't privy to. I thought about
Mhm.
all the conversations behind closed doors that like my mum would have had as when I was going to school. And it's not something that you really think about, but actually upon reflection, there's definitely been times where she's had a lot more conversations and a lot more input into something that I haven't had an
Yeah.
effing clue about, and it's
Yeah.
just made that I've meant that I've had a positive experience. But it's like there's so much to be said in the fight and tenacity of, yes, a disabled person. Like we can all agree on that. There's no point in having that conversation. But actually, in disabled parents, like parents of disabled kids, because they fight tooth and nail for their kids.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much that is difficult and it shouldn't be difficult, and it's complicated and it shouldn't be complicated, and it's scary and emotional at times and it shouldn't be that scary and emotional. But there's things we're all trying to do to make the world more inclusive and barrier free, and we'll keep chipping away on that. But it's sort of in the interim, we all have to respond and deal with those situations, and we can choose whether it beats us or we give up or we give in, or we, yeah, like our parents had put the flag in the sand and said, no, 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 I'm not taking no for an answer.
Yeah. I love that so much, because I just think I would absolutely hate, and I mean, I would hate to come up against like the mother of a disabled child in an
Yeah,
argument. I'd be like, okay, you win,
yeah, you
take
will. Yeah.
it.
And I think we'll maybe come on to it soon anyway, but then there's that transition where having a parent that's got your back when you're like nursery, primary school age is so important. And even going into secondary school, but there's that point where
Yeah.
if the parents are a bit protecting us from the world, that being wrapped in cotton wool can be problematic later. So there's such a nuanced balance in a way to being there for your child and having the chats as we've just spoke about, but then eventually empowering us as an individual to go out and do that for ourselves. And that's a real talent, I think, as a parent.
Yeah. It's actually so interesting that you bring that point, because you spoke about primary school, but I was going to see if we could move on to secondary school, because I think what you said is so true. There's a very, very fine line between being protective and fighting for your child's right, but then being overbearing. And that tends to also happen about when we move schools, when we're about secondary school, because obviously that's teenage years. It's when you're developing who you are as a person, your hormones are raging, you want to
Yeah,
be like the most independent person, you also think you're the wisest person in the room. And when you look back, like I look back at 15-year-old me, and I'm like, you knew absolutely sweet FA and you thought you knew it all.
yeah.
But that experience for you, what was it like transitioning at secondary school? And as you said, that kind of time where parents are amazing, they're fighting for you, but also you're kind of developing who you are as a sense of self and all of that kind of stuff that comes along with it.
Yeah, so that there was actually a battle that my parents couldn't win going to secondary, which was the local secondary school wasn't wheelchair accessible. And they did try their hardest to get the school to sort it out. And,
Yeah.
I think there was a financial element of making the school properly wheelchair accessible was too, rightly or wrongly, it was deemed
Too
too
much.
expensive or whatever. Yeah. So all of my mates from primary went to the local secondary. I had to go, which now doesn't seem that far away. It was about half an hour away. But as an 11-year-old, that seemed like a
Oh my
very
God,
long
that's so
way.
much time.
Yeah, exactly. That was every morning and every night. And that was on a minibus with other wheelchair users having not as I said before, being the only disabled in the village, I was suddenly on what we self-defined it as the special bus, back to that, dark humour that we're allowed to have as disabled people. And so I think, again, there's two ways that could have all gone. I could have been very victim-y, very upset. And I was upset. Like, I'm not denying I did feel very upset. But in the long run, I made new friends at the school. I kept in touch with my old friends because I still lived back in the area where they were. I got to meet other disabled people for the first time, apart from my two cousins, but like more that had a disability like I did as well. And the school were more geared up for physio and TAs and like going swimming at a hydrotherapy pool. So in classes, I was still basically the only disabled person, but through the whole school, there was a lot more disabled students. So it was kind of the best of both worlds. But that first bit was not nice, that I had to go further away and leave my friends behind as well.
Yeah. Interesting what you said is that it kind of became the first time that you met other disabled students with a similar disability to you, because as you said before, you were the only disabled person in the village. And I keep going to say the only gay in the village because of Little Britain. And I'm like, no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about
that is why I purposefully say it that way, though. It's very much a Little Britain inspired comment.
And what was that experience like for you, meeting other disabled people? Because and quite often what we find is that with disabled people in schools, like you are probably the only person in the room who has a disability, if it's like physical or you're using a wheelchair, but to have that experience where you meet other people who are like you, again at that formative age, what was that like for you?
Yeah, I think it was sort of, I almost remember it being kind of good and bad. It was like not wanting to have to be with disabled people because I'm disabled. But I think in that, being self-aware now was my own sort of ableism as well. It was this like, I don't want to be seen as the disability part of me isn't all of me. And so there was a lot about assimilating, trying to fit into like societal narratives and stereotypes, all that kind of stuff. But as an 11, 12-year-old, you're not aware of any of that. You're just kind of, does this feel okay or does this not feel okay? And it was a bit of both. It was partly like fighting against that being put in a box, but also my other friends that I'd had previously, they never quite got what it was to ask someone to help you pee in a bottle, because I always like to use a bottle and get more kind of go into the toilet stuff now. But like that's my life. Someone has to help me go to the toilet, right? And so my other friends never could however much they tried to, they didn't understand what that felt like. Whereas these other new friends, they got it because that was their life as well. So it was a sort of bittersweet time of those two opposing feelings, I suppose.
Yeah. I love what you said about at that time you just didn't have the language to express what you're feeling, because actually, like, reflection and hindsight is freaking fabulous, right? We all love a bit of hindsight, like, oh, I should have done this and I should have done that. Well, you didn't, because you only did what you could with what you had.
Yes.
But I really liked what you said about almost like your internalized ableism, because you didn't want to be with the disabled kids because you didn't want that to be like that's just who you are and that's your identity. And actually, as we'll get on to, like, with the work that you do, how important it is to almost unravel that and pick that apart. But obviously, at that age, you don't have that language, you don't have that vocabulary, you haven't actually got an effing clue what's going on inside your own head. Like, as you said, you only know if something feels good or bad, and if it doesn't feel good, you don't always have the language to express as the reasons why.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really interesting though, isn't it? Because nobody teaches you about internalized ableism as a disabled kid. And that blows my brain, because it's a conversation that really needs to be had. Because had we had these conversations as younger children, there would be so many times in our lives where we wouldn't have, like, almost shunned our disabled identities because we see it as this perceived bad thing because society has expressed that it's not good, when actually now we're all a bit more educated, we know that that's wrong.
Yeah. I think I was pondering, and one of my best friends is gay, and when he came out, he was very aware of so much of his upbringing and societal stereotypes, etc., that he almost judged gay people, and he is gay, and so but for me, in that internal ableism point, I couldn't pretend to the world that I wasn't disabled because I'm sat in a big 100-odd-kilogram wheelchair. So it's a bit hard to pretend. And so there's not an overt point here, but I think partly there's a point around, I think it's fascinating, the DEI strands. There's so many parallels and similarities that the more we can connect, the more we all have an even more powerful voice against oppressive forces, and we can go off into sort of politics and economics and all that. But even just culturally and stereotypically, there's a sort of power in that, not like other bit to that original point, like othering just disabled people or LGBTQT plus and race and in these separate buckets. It's like bringing it back to the humanity, really, isn't it? And so the disabled part of me couldn't run away literally from being disabled, but there were other parts of whatever my environment was, and that's not saying any of the environment was bad, but just societal environment, judged disability one way or another. And that was quite an inner conflict, I suppose.
Yeah. And it is, and like, as we've got more language surrounding disability, as we've become a bit more educated in society, it's really important to have those conversations that actually, do you know what, we've all kind of had that experience. And like, as a disabled person, if you're going through that whole moment where you're like, is it internalized ableism? Is it just like, I hate the fact that I'm disabled? Which one is it? It's like, we've almost all been there. And like, reach out to someone who else is disabled, because I'm pretty sure they'll feel like they can pinpoint a moment when they're like, do you know what, I felt the exact same way about 2 weeks ago, and then I just really needed a good sleep, and I just needed to like have a moment where I realized society's just a bit shit.
And to your point, it's dynamic, right? It's not just when I was 11 or 13 or 15. It could be last week or today sometimes as well.
Yeah, so true. And it is, you're so right, it is dynamic, and it's not, you can't just like slap a band-aid on it, because it's not like a scratch it's going to heal over. This is one of those things that, and I've said this before, and I thought it was really eloquent, even though I said it, which I am giving myself a pat on the back for how well I said it. But quite often, externalized ableism is the catalyst for really quite intense internalized ableism, because it's reflecting that view of society back onto yourself, which as a disabled person, I would quite happily say that I'm very aware of how society works, probably more so than peers of my own age, because of just how I've had to move through the world. So when that externalized voice is risen, and I can feel it, and it reflects back onto myself, it only reflects that part where I'm like, oh, that's really uncomfortable, because that backs up this idea that society doesn't want me to be here, and that makes me feel like a shitty human being, and it makes me feel less than. And it's kind of one of those moments where you've got to be like, okay, take a breather, have a hot second. Is that actually true? Yes, society does not want me to be here. There are absolute like barrier problems all the time. We could talk about that until the cows come home.
Yeah.
But am I actually a bad person? No. The two are very different, and it's being able to separate them that's important.
Yeah. And ultimately, all of it is our own individual inner beliefs. Like, of course, there are societal trends and cultures, and there are societal barriers, and there are, friends or bullies in the world. Like, all that's real. But I know that for me, the last probably 2 to 3 years, I've done a lot more inner work, and that's such a loaded thing to say, but like, essentially, I have shown more of a light inside me of what my beliefs are and how I feel about things. And it became very apparent that despite having just turned 40 and done all sorts of cool stuff in the world and work and all of the things I'd set out to do 20 years ago, say, but there was this bit right inside of me that was still very fearful and feeling very vulnerable. That, you know, when you look at like social care funding, struggles around finding personal care assistance, the pandemic, like there was all these things that I suddenly felt really more fearful and more vulnerable than I had since I was that sort of 14, 15-year-old Martyn. And I actually really needed to sit with that properly. And as a consequence of that, whatever's going on in the world, however good, bad, or indifferent, I've got a little bit more of a centered anchor point. Whereas there were so many times in life I was just sort of doing it with a bit of ignorance and naivety, and positivity will get me through. And so that's been a really fascinating thing to have gone through just very recently, actually.
That ties in really nicely with like your like to think about how disability, like regardless of what your disability is, if it has impacted the career choices that you've made, because quite often non-disabled people do not think about how their arms and legs work in the working environment, right? They work for them, there's no issue. If they're tired, they have a coffee, they crack on. But it's not like that for disabled people. And I was wondering, when it came to choosing your career and actually now developing your career a bit more, was your disability taken into account when you were thinking about what you wanted to do? But also, how has that evolved and developed into what you do now?
Yeah, I love this topic. So I would say like younger me wanted to be a footballer, and then there was a bit of a pragmatic side of that might be tricky. So maybe football manager. So that was like, you know, kind of 6-year-old, 7-year-old me. There was something around kind of, you know, almost political, like being prime minister or something one day as like 9-year-old me. But I think more in the teen years, it was, getting more practical and more grounded and more pragmatic. Was, you know, I'm not going to probably be a fireman or, you know, doing my own milk round. So it's going to be something more about intellect and mind. And then I also, like, my dad's always worked in an office, and I thought I'd love to have a job where I have a desk and my own telephone. That was like another childhood visualization, if you like. So there wasn't a lot around what the exact job or career path would be, but it was something about a phone and a desk, and it wasn't going to be sliding down fire poles. And then through education, I did economics at uni and then a master's in marketing. So there was a lot around business, I suppose. But when I went to get my first job, that I was struggling to get work in the sort of finance sector because it felt like maybe there was a bit of ableism going on. Like it's hard to say either way, but I know I didn't feel confident, like, will I manage in that world either? So my first job was at a disability charity, and that was, pragmatic and by design so that I could figure it all out for me personally, you know, in terms of like, could I do Monday to Friday, 9 to 5? How would I get to an office, in an office, get help where necessary, like lifting heavy folders, whatever it might be. So that was my first step into work. And if I'm honest, kind of to what we touched on before, I did not want to work in disability because it felt a bit cliche and a bit obvious. Here I am 20 years later, having done shitloads of stuff around disability inclusion. But the pivotal point was, at that charity, I got very passionate about the global scale of the challenge. The fact lots of people like me face all these barriers that we've been talking about already today. And actually, some of the business background was a tool to help not only solve it, but part of the puzzle to solve it. And so bit by bit, things aligned that I actually did want to work in this sector. It was really rewarding, probably more than if I just gone and got an economic finance job in the city. And those skills still drive all that I have done and am doing at the moment. So you look back and all the dots joined in a lovely, fluffy way, but there was a lot of, I don't know what I'm doing now, and I'm figuring this out as I go. But yeah, looking back sort of 20 years or so, I can see how that's all come together quite nicely.
Yeah. I love what you said about like your optimism and positivity would get you through. Like, yeah, okay, like we're just riding on optimism, we're riding on positivity, like it's gonna happen, it's gonna happen. And actually it's almost sometimes like you're like, yes, that is amazing and I'm so happy for you, but let's be like semi-realistic about the situation. That doesn't always get you through. But like, good for you that you like backed yourself well enough to be like, I'm gonna do it, and then you're like, okay, maybe I will change my mind.
Yeah. You've always got to be open to being flexible and making changes, for sure.
Yeah. And so with what you do now, and having that like first fire and that first start when you worked for the disability charity that you first worked for, as your career has progressed and you've seen I don't want to be like disability changing through time, but maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I don't really answer that question. But have you seen positive changes being made in the spaces that you've been working in over the like 20 years of your career?
Oh yeah, definitely. So when I was at the charity, I started blogging in about 2009. And so that was like a new tool, the sort of rise of social media and all that world. So that gave me a voice and a platform that I wouldn't have had a few years earlier. And the reason I started Disability Horizons with Shrin, who was a friend and sort of fellow disabled entrepreneur, was to give a platform for lots of disabled people to write articles on topics that were more lifestyle related. Because at that time, there was a lot of politic kind of publications and movement. It was all around the austerity time, and there was the hardest hit March around 2010, 2011. So there was a lot of politics, but the sort of use of technology and the use of entrepreneurship was quite new. And it's sort of ironic. It feels like technology and social media has given such a powerful platform to so many disabled people, which is phenomenal. And business is sort of understanding more now what the benefit of disability inclusion for the business and for disabled people.
Yeah.
However, it feels like we took our eye off the politics a little bit. And that's partly as a disabled community, partly as a world. Like the politics is just a bit, generally a bit crazy anyway. Yeah. So I'm quite interested more recently how we get more representation and change back in politics. But I think there's been a lot of positives in business and in technology and in media, the sort of representation in media as well.
And media is obviously one of the big things that you're involved with, because obviously you are involved with Purple Goat. And for those who don't know, what is Purple Goat?
What is Purple Goat? So, because I think that the two sides of it, my whole background and career is about disability inclusion. The whole mission and purpose for me is how the world is inclusive for disabled people. But the bit where we need brands and businesses to listen to us, make changes with us, and have us in marketing, you have to speak the language of businesses and of brands. So Purple Goat fundamentally is a marketing agency, and our clients are big global brands that realize they need to get their act together, morally, but also from a business growth perspective. And so Purple Goat facilitates that. We have surveys and roundtables so brands can hear the needs and wants of disabled people. We have consulting and training to help brand staff get upskilled on disability. And the kind of original service and the core bit is of the marketing budget brands have, we can help them spend that with disabled content creators and get the message out through social media, basically. So it's kind of like a 360 marketing agency that helps brands be better in the disability sense and in the business sense. But it's just really important for me, it doesn't just get seen as a business agency, marketing, like it's built out of an absolute need for the world to be more inclusive and fair and just for disabled people. And that's maybe the fuel that drives a lot of what we do at Purple Goat.
Yeah. I love what you said there about, actually, it was one of the first things, you like businesses who just want to be morally better. Because actually, when you think about it, inclusion at its heart is like morally correct. And that's like, you know, your moral compass is, if you've got a good moral compass, inclusion should be right at the heart of your business and what you're doing. And actually, I've got so much time for that, because there's a lot to be said for being able to call people out, particularly like big brands, and particularly those brands who claim that they're inclusive who aren't inclusive at all. There's so much to be said and being like, actually, do you know what? You could do a lot better if you just worked with us, because you'd probably learn something new and you'd probably take something on board. And actually, not only would you learn something, but you would grow your business as well. And like being able to have the confidence to back that up, I think is invaluable, particularly in this day and age.
Yeah. I think the reason we are going really well at Purple Goat, we're growing, we're employing lots of people. It's, created jobs in general. It's created jobs with probably, I think we're more than 50% of our team have a disability. Like there's all those kind of lovely metrics about it. But the reason, I think it's because we get business and we get disability. So if you've got a generic marketing agency, they don't understand disability like we do. But then you've got a bit like sort of disability charities, they don't get marketing and business like we do. So it's that really sweet crossover point that we speak the business language, but it's absolutely nothing about us without us. It's disabled people, dictating what needs to be looked at and changed and, spoken about in the marketing campaigns.
Yeah, I love that. I think disabled people should just be on billboards everywhere all the time.
Absolutely.
Interestingly.
One just quick thing I was going to say was the stat that we also, I guess like the value proposition is that there was a research done, it's a little bit dated and we're hoping we can get up-to-date figures, but I think Lloyds Bank did the research, 0.06% of adverts feature disabled people. And as we know, there's like 20% of any given population has a disability. So really, Purple Goat's just looking to close that gap. And then the benefits come off the back of that.
0.06. It's not even 1%.
If you say, like, think of a TV ad with disability, most people think of the Malteser ad. And it was brilliant with Sam Renk, Renke, I don't know if it's Renk or Renke, but Sam will forgive me for that, I'm sure. But she was amazing in that advert, as were the other people involved. That was years ago, though. And, like, that's the main advert that people still talk about. So, yeah.
0.06. It's not even 1%.
Exactly.
To represent 20% of any given population.
And the reason that we use the influencer marketing, social media marketing format is that we can work with multiple disabled people from all the sub-communities of disability, all as part of a holistic campaign, rather than waiting for the next TV ad to want to cast the disabled person. We can we can have that representation all day, every day through social media marketing.
Yeah. My God, like I'm just like infuriated by the 0.06 because it's not even 1%. And like, if that doesn't drive the point home as to why you do what you do,
Yeah,
then you're not going to get it if you don't get why that's such a problem. Because if
absolutely.
0.06% is
Yeah,
meant to represent 20%, like,
yeah,
I am not good at maths, right? Like, I'll happily hold my hand up. I'm really bad at maths. That's why I've got an accountant. They're much better at it than I am. But if you can't understand that 0.06 does not equal 20,
yeah,
you need to go back to school.
100%. Yeah, totally.
Oh my gosh. That is wild. Really, really wild. Interestingly, I like to think about harder times that we've had as disabled people, right? Like, we've all gone through some. For everybody in this life, regardless of whether you're disabled or not, you go through shit. Doesn't matter who you are. If you haven't, it's probably coming your way. Like, it's very, very naive of you to think that at some point you won't be scathed by something bad that's happened in your life.
Yeah,
But if you can look back on that time and notice a positive trait that you have, that you fostered, I think you kind of learn something from it. And I was wondering, is there any particular trait that's positive about yourself that you look back on and you think, do you know what, I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of how I handled that situation. I'm really glad I developed that particular trait.
yeah, because I think I have often worn the sort of positive, optimistic, smiley, happy-go-lucky part of my nature as a badge of honor for a lot of life. Like, that's authentically me, and I like that
Yeah.
about me. But to your point, and I mentioned earlier a little bit about the last 2 to 3 years and having done a bit more of that inner work, there was a load of things just were not in a good place at kind of end of 2021. It was like a bit of the toll of the pandemic. A good friend passed away with SMA. I burned out starting and getting Purple Goat off the ground. I then did get COVID, and I wasn't terribly ill, thankfully, but my energy was like knocked for a while. Then my confidence was knocked because I'm like, I need to keep running this business, but I'm not well at the moment. And so it was like everything just all came at once. And that was the point about positivity couldn't just get me through that.
Yeah.
And so it's almost a similar flavor or a bit of a tangent, but it was more than not giving up and the being patient. And I think that that's what I saw more of in myself, and want to channel more of in the future. That instead of, because I can be really critical, like to myself. I mean, like I've got big ambitions. I still want to do, more with Purple Go, other business ideas, political representation, all of that. And in a day, a week, a month, a year, it can feel like you're not getting that far. But then when you look at longer period of time, I'm like, wow, a lot happened, and we as people do a lot in that longer period. So yeah, something around that kind of resilience and not giving up when times are hard, and that sort of bounce back ability, and just having that patience to ride out those storms.
I love, 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 love what you said about patience, because patience and positivity aren't the same, but quite often they can go hand in hand. And like,
Yeah.
being able to have them hand in hand is a really unique skill. I, as a person, am inherently impatient. Like, I'm well aware that I want everything done yesterday. And if it isn't done in the next like 5 minutes, I'm like, why? Like,
Yeah.
when someone doesn't respond to my emails within like 2 hours of me sending it, I'm like, well, how rude are they?
Yeah.
And then I have to have like that moment where I take a step back and I'm like, well, no, people have lives, and that's just how it works. I just like
Yeah.
things done immediately.
But do you ever like try to hurry up the outcome, that whether it's someone replying from an email or anything else? Do you try to like exert some influence or control over it? Like, I'm saying that because for me, I can see when I'm getting impatient, I try to change the outcome to where I want it to, but there's always that fine line of just pushing too hard.
Not really, but I'm always quite like, I just need a response. Like, I don't mind what your response is, but I just need a
Yeah,
response.
yeah,
And like, you just need to let me know where we're going. And if you're not in, absolutely fine, do not worry about it. But if you are, and you need to let me know, because if you are, there are other steps to take and we need to all
yeah,
move
yeah,
this
yeah,
forward.
yeah,
And so I think for me, my impatience is very much like, right, let's get it done. And if it's not going to get done with you, right, see you later, I'm on to the next one. And that doesn't worry me. But I would love to be able to foster like just a scotch more patience.
mm-hmm.
But then I look at all the women in my family, and every single one of them is just as impatient as me, if not more unimpatient than I am. And I'm like, oh, like, am I going to get even more impatient as I get older? Like, that could be a problem, because I'm pretty impatient now.
I think another thing I've learned the last couple of years is like there's so many contradictions and paradoxes. So it's like one thing is to be aware of our, even the word weakness is very loaded, but you know, the things that we like to improve, that kind of what we're
Yeah.
discussing now. But the other part is we all do have a sort of nature about us. There are certain traits that are just, you know,
Who we are.
genetically or otherwise hardwired into us. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think there's something about self-awareness is like, I can know that I get impatient. I can try to be more patient, but I can also just accept sometimes I suck at that.
Yeah.
And that's fine as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I love that as well, because I was having one of those, we all love them, those deep chats we have with our pals, right? The kind of conversation that should have stopped at about 3 a.m. but actually carried on until 6 a.m. in the morning,
Yeah,
one of
yeah, yeah.
those. And we were sat there, and yes, we were drinking, and it was just a really lovely evening. And then she just came out with one of the most profound things that I've ever heard, that actually, like, at that time it seemed really profound, but I'd heard it before. And she was like, but two things can be true at once. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, like in my state of being like, we're very much deep into the woo woo chat, like we're talking about life, and I was like, oh my god, two things can be true at once. I was like, and as a disabled person, I think I understood that way more than anybody else in the room, because everyone else was like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, all right, like shut up. And I was like, no, 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 guys, she's right. Like, two things can be true at once. And that kind of harks back to the point that you made about, I know that I get impatient, but I suck at being patient, and like the two things are true at once. So
Yeah,
actually just kind of accept at the point that you're at. But
yeah,
having that moment where you're like, two things can be true at once, also harks back to that internalized able and externalized ableism. Because yes, the world can be like, do you know what, you're not wanted here. That's true. But you can also feel like that yourself, but that's because
yeah.
the external has kind of validated that feeling that you've had within yourself. And actually the only person that can almost stop yourself feeling that way is you. Enough of my woo woo. That was quite deep. That was very deep.
I love it.
But
I love it.
when it comes to disability, I have noticed that we get asked some quite weird questions by the general public and by people just in general. And I was wondering, is there like a particular set of questions that people ask you surrounding your disability that when you hear them, you're either like, not this one again, or you've got like a really quick-witted response that is like your first response for like, oh, why are you in a chair? And someone's like, bum, 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 it's because a shark bit my legs off, or something along those lines. Do you have one of those?
Yeah, I think the sort of teenage years in my 20s, with definitely being more out in the nightlife, shall we say, with the
Mm-hmm.
partying and the alcohol, that's when I remember getting a lot more of those random kind of interactions.
Yeah.
And then through my 30s, the sorts of like having a nice dinner with my partner and watching Netflix. Obviously, you're not getting as many random people talking to you because you're on your own in the living room, maybe. And then also work wise, you know, and I mean, I suppose with Purple Goat, we are pushing out sort of, so we are now in the middle of the marketing industry. So we are
Mm.
working with other agencies and with brands that don't know disability, but it's in a very professional setting. So
Yes.
I think there's a wariness on their side not to say anything a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, you know, that's going to be judged. And I know actually for a lot of the work stuff, the biggest challenge is the fear that they've got of doing or saying the wrong thing, which
Mm-hmm.
sometimes holds them back. So that's slightly tangential to your question, but I think that's just generally quite an interesting observation. But what I'm sort of saying is the last 10 years, I can't remember as many weird and wacky questions and interactions, but definitely in my like clubby party, like travel the world sort of 20s. Yeah, it was all of that. It was like, why are you in a chair? And so my mates would come up with some random, or I would come up with some random different excuse every time I got asked. You know, if I was out with my partner, it would be like, you know, that the old sort of is she your carer? And you're like, well, why would you presume that? And yeah, like I once or twice I got bluntly asked, can you have sex? And it was just like, hello, stranger in a pub. Like, is this an
Hi,
offer?
my name's Martyn.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like all the stuff we've heard is the general tropes and narratives. I've definitely had them personally as well.
Yeah. I find it so funny that people just love to really get under the skin of disability. But actually, to your point that you said about people being fearful to ask questions, it's so true, because people are scared to say the wrong thing. And it's a really fine line, isn't it, between I want to ask this question because I want to know the answer, but I want to know, and it's why do you want to know the answer? Is it, do you want to know the answer because it's going to benefit you and your knowledge and develop your own like ability to read the situation better? Or is it just because you're maybe morbidly curious? In which case, if you're morbidly curious, you need to fuck off, because that's not what this is about. Like, our disabilities are not here to entertain or for display for you. But if you want to learn and almost be able to read the room better and have more informed conversations, then sure, go ahead. But it's always where that intent lies. And I think that's a really important takeaway, is you can be nervous, but you can also be nervous with good intent, and that's okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the fear thing, so the reason I mentioned it happened more when I used to be out partying more was alcohol, because people's inhibitions are removed and they feel more free to ask the question that they actually wanted to ask. So, you know, we could, on the sales pitches we have at Purple Go, it would be interesting if we got all of the people we're pitching pissed and see what kind of questions.
See what happens.
I mean, that would be a great experiment, by the way. We'd probably get a lot more yeses.
If that's going to happen, I'm coming. I'm inviting myself to said party, because I'll have a whale of a time.
But I think
Oh no, you go.
Sorry, I was just going to say your point about, you know, if someone wants to understand something better, it doesn't have to be the random person with a disability in the pub that night. Like, you know, you and I work in this world as well. So we're generally happy and able to educate where someone is looking for that education. But there are times, I'm sure, that you and I are out and we're not in work mode. We are in a pub just with our friends having a drink. So I guess I'm saying that it shouldn't be that individually disabled people always have to be the educators in every single context.
I only have one final question for you, Martyn, and I have to say I've really enjoyed this chat. I've really liked how we've been able to tie like a holistic approach to disability into the conversation, and I think that's a really important note to make, is that actually when we're talking about disability, it can be very much like one-sided, particularly when everybody's disability is different. But I've loved this because we've kind of been able to encapsulate so much more than just your experience and my experience, and I really appreciate that. But my final question for you is, Martyn, are you disabled and proud?
I am, absolutely.
Oh, amazing. Oh, I've had such a good time. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've loved it. And I know I say that all the time, but I love these conversations. They like fill me with all the goodness of the world, and I've loved it.
Yeah, no, it's been, like you said, we've covered, as we said at the beginning, we covered a lot of different ground, a lot of topics, and there's still so much more I'm sure we could have gone into as well. I think the politics stuff is something we, as a community, need to get a bit more. It doesn't need to become this, like, I know I was always a bit worried about being an angry activist, inverted commas. And as I've got older, I'm like, actually, there were times we should be angry. Like, anger is okay. But I think there is constructive activism, but either way, I think there's a lot around campaigning and politics that we all need to come together a little bit more kind of clearly with, as things are getting a little bit dicey in some areas at the moment. And I think to your point about the different perspectives, we always get lumped as this homogenous group of people. And not only do we have different disabilities, but we do have different political views and socio-economic experiences. And it makes it such a rich conversation and rich topic. But yeah, I think there is a real need to like bring people together on what we have in common more going forward, and not this very divisive nature in the world that we've seen lately.
Yeah. I feel like a part 2 is going to come about because I want to talk all about this politics with you. So we're gonna stay tuned for that part 2 because it's going to come. I can feel it. Thank you so much.
There's a lot bubbling around at the moment, so yeah, we definitely should do that.
Oh my gosh! Okay, no, that makes me really excited. That means there is going to be a part 2. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you giving up your time to pop on stage and just chat to me. I've loved it. It's been so good, and part 2 is definitely on its way.
Thank you for having me on your amazing podcast.